Hello, my name is Andre Roy, and I'm the Associate Vice President for the David Rothenberg Center for Public Policy. Welcome to Both Sides of the Bars, a discussion-driven show that examines the legal system from various perspectives, including people most impacted by the criminal legal system. We discuss critical questions about how the system works, its intersections with social justice, and highlight the efforts that are being made to improve the lives of everyone that is affected by it. We ask you, the listener, or the viewer rather, to join Both Sides of the Bars and to share your comments on Twitter at The Fortune Society or at The Fortune S-O-C. We look forward to hearing from you. Today, we're going to be talking about some of the things that are happening in upstate New York and how criminal legal reform is much needed during this day and time. American prisons have more than 1.5 million individuals, which is an increase over 390% since 1978. The growth persisted even in the face of overarching decline in crime rates since the 1990s and the longest terms of incarceration since we began to collect accurate data. Over 600,000 men and women are released from federal and state prisons each year. Upon release, they face many practical and social challenges to rejoining their communities, with many of them frustrated by barriers to opportunities due to a lack of education and political skills. A recent study shows that current strategies used by our justice system to achieve rehabilitation and increased public safety have been ineffective, with more than 80% of those leaving our state prisons being returned back in the future. Most Americans agree with the conclusion from the data that something must change and that something is clearly wrong. And if we are to achieve our effective justice system that protects and enhances public safety while at the same time respecting the humanity and dignity of people who are coming out of prisons, it is important that we begin to examine ways in which that we can change the criminal legal system as it currently is. In this episode of Both Sides of the Bars, we talked to Mayor Myrick out of Ithaca. And Mayor Myrick, he's the mayor of the city of Ithaca, New York, to hear his thoughts on criminal legal reform and what can be done to repair the system. Mayor Myrick, thanks so much for joining us here at Both Sides of the Bars, and welcome. How are you feeling today?
Thank you so much, Andre. I really, really appreciate you having me on and feeling good today, as good as one can in the current environment. So happy to be here.
Absolutely. And I really want to get right to it. Our viewers are always anticipating Both Sides of the Bars to hear from our guests who offer analyses and feedback to how we can begin to affect meaningful change within the criminal legal reform system. And so our starting point will be, Mayor Myrick, is that what do you see as some of the inherent challenges within our current criminal justice, or what we refer to as the criminal legal system?
Yeah, I think it really starts, and that's such a good place to start, because we really have to start with what our intentions are in this system. It is too easy to go astray when you don't have a firm sense of the mission. What is the mission? What is it that we want to accomplish? And I think if you polled Americans, you would get answers all over the map, which is, does the criminal system exist to punish people, or does it exist to rehabilitate them? And to answer that, you have to have a shared philosophy of people. That is to say, can people improve in their behavior? And does antisocial behavior, that is, behavior that negatively impacts other people, is that something that's inherent? Or is it the result of a series of incentives and guidelines? And I believe that people are inherently good, that they want to be good to each other, that they want to fulfill a social contract, and they will if they're able to. And then if they're not able to, then society has got to figure out new structures and find ways to help those people be better versions of themselves. Now, if you have the other philosophy, if you believe that the criminal system exists to punish and to discipline, then you end up, honestly, with a system very similar to the one we have now, where you incarcerate more people than anywhere else in the world. But also, this important point: people who go through the criminal justice system are more likely to reoffend than people who don't. That is an example of a system that's not working. I think we have to build a system in which people who go through it is almost therapeutic, in the same way that physical therapy, if you go through physical therapy for your left shoulder ends up stronger. We should have a system in which, once you go through it, the therapeutic effects, the educational, the beneficial reconstructive effects leave you a stronger person for it. That's what I think we should build.
Absolutely. And you're the executive of the city, right? Of Ithaca. You're the mayor.
Yes.
And so obviously you're responsible for the entire city and what impacts it. And so what have been some of your progressive ideas relative to engaging people who have had justice involvement coming from prisons or jails? To your point, Mayor, you've mentioned that, some on one side, right, there's this idea of punishment. Right. Then there's some belief that there's maybe some genetic basis to people's criminality. And then there's the other side that you're talking about, right? The idea that the environment, right, systems have impacted people in such a way that people are engaged in behaviors that harm others. And this is not to trivialize or minimize the impact that harm has on people when people do a crime and commit a crime in some way, but there are oftentimes environmental factors that shapes people's perception to survive, that causes a desensitivity toward human life. So I talked about some of the ways that you're thinking about engaging Ithaca around punishment and people getting access to supports and other kind of things that will help them live a life of contribution.
Sure. Yeah. And there's a lot of different ways to think about the work we've done. I kind of think of it in three different tranches. I mean, first there's the upstream approach, then there's the point of intake, and then there's what comes after. So it's like before, during, after. Upstream, how do you prevent crime in the first place, right? And how do you change what society considers to be a crime? And so how do you prevent crime? We know some of those answers, right? And I think to know those answers, you got to study. There's a lot of work where we study the poor to understand poverty. You study people convicted of crimes to understand crime. It's actually more useful to study what works. Take a look at young people who never end up in trouble and ask yourself, what's going on in their life that they never end up in trouble? And often what you find is stability in the home, right? So young people that are not being forced to move around a lot year to year. We moved around a lot as a young person. We didn't have a lot of money. I was actually in and out of homelessness for the first 8 years of my life. But I was blessed in that I was stable and that my mother was so strong and so present. And we also had my grandparents, my two grandparents, that added quite a lot of stability to our early life. That combined, when you add what also works well for young people who are engaged in extracurricular activities, people who are engaged in sports, right? People who are engaged in the faith community, and people with employment, right? Young people who have jobs. Those folks are far less likely to end up committing crime. So what do we do? In the city of Ithaca, we've pumped money and resources into those programs. Especially our youth services are the fastest growing under the last 10 years I've been mayor. When we look at our budgets, the fastest departments by a mile, fastest growing ones, the ones that we're pushing more and more resources in, is the Youth Bureau and GIAC. As a result, those are the youth services. As a result, our crime rate was decreasing when our unemployment rate was decreasing. Now, what happened last year in 2020? Unemployment rate skyrocketed. Guess what happened? Crime went up.
So there's a nexus between employment and the reduction in crime and unemployment and an increase in crime. Is that correct, Mayor?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Economic security provides a base, and there's a lot of reasons why you can imagine that. I mean, the most simplest is if you have income, then you don't need to rob or steal or deal drugs for income, right? That's like an easy way to think about it. But there's something else too that happens, which is employment, particularly meaningful employment, helps people feel better about themselves. When you feel better about yourself, you're less likely to get into an altercation, to do something reckless, to self-harm, to drink too much, to use drugs, to drink and drive. So all of those kind of crimes go down too when you have full employment. You also have just the thing that says, I got to work tomorrow. I got to work tomorrow. Shift starts at 8. I'm going to go to bed tonight before, as my mother always said, nothing good happens out there after 11 o'clock. So if you got to get up and go to work, you're less likely to get in trouble. So we focus a lot upstream. Then there's the point of arrest itself. And this is where really too, you have to adjust. What does it mean for something to be a crime in a society? What is illegal and what's not illegal? And, when you look at marijuana, for example, it is quite obvious that it is no more harmful than Chardonnay being legal, marijuana being illegal. It was all about who you're trying to criminalize for what. So decriminalizing, in effect, making marijuana our lowest level enforcement priority here in Ithaca was a very important thing that we did way back in 2012. Right? So marijuana is still technically illegal in New York State, but for our department, it's just the lowest level priority. We don't make arrests for it. We rarely even ticket for it anymore.
And New Jersey has taken a step forward, obviously, in the legalization process. And it seems as though New York may be following suit to legalize it for recreational use and for adult use, with obviously restrictions and some parameters there. I wonder, is Ithaca looking at something similar, because it's quite progressive to do the criminalization of drug possession, like small amounts of marijuana possession, and or even substance use, right? Because there's also been the criminalization of substance use. People have chemical dependency issues, and that has been criminalized. So to your point, like Mayor, has Ithaca thought about something like that? Because it's really progressive. And do you know if other neighboring state mayors or neighboring city mayors have a similar thought at some point? Because it seems as though that's where things are moving slowly but progressively.
Yes, for sure. We would like to very much go further, faster. We're pushing the state. So fully decriminalizing is something that only the state government can do. But we've been lobbying for that since 2012 and since 2016 when we released what's known as the Ithaca Plan, which was our removal, frankly, of the war on drugs mentality, and instead an approach to drug use which places it in the public health frame, right? If this is a health problem, then how do we attack it with a public health solution? And this last year has been like a crash course in what are public health solutions. We now know about contact tracing and paying people to stay home and doing all sorts of things that seemed unlikely. Harm reduction, right? What is harm reduction? It's wearing a mask when you go out in public. You know you might be exposed when you go in public, but if you wear a mask, you're less likely to be exposed. There are similar public health approaches to drug policy, and we like to pursue them all the way up to and including supervised injection facilities, right? Places where people who use drugs intravenously, instead of using on the street, in alleys and on sidewalks, could come indoors, where they can inject. There could be a nurse or other healthcare professional there to prevent overdoses, but also to help begin the intake process for people who are considering recovery and want to get clean and want to get healthy.
And there are models out there, right, Mayor? It's not like what you're bringing up is something you're blowing out and pulling out of the air. There are actual models in, on the West Coast, for example, California, different places. There are the models about
Vancouver, Toronto. The earliest facilities are actually in Switzerland, a couple other places in Europe, Australia, and they've all found the effect, which is that not only do fewer people die of overdoses, but more people go into recovery, and actually follow-on crimes decrease as well. It makes the entire community safer. Now, why has it been so hard for us to adapt this in America? I think it goes back to what we talked about at the beginning. For us, we view the criminal justice system as a form to punish certain people. If somebody's using drugs, we need to punish them. The idea being, I think, that if you punish them, they'll stop doing it, and that it's the fear of punishment that motivates people primarily. I think in European nations, they have a different view, which is that if people are doing behavior that is bad for them and bad for the community, they need help in stopping that behavior, and then they don't need to just be punished out of it. That's why it's been successful in other places, and I think could be more successful here. And then, so after the intake, you got to have court systems that help rehabilitate. And we've had diversion programs that have had great success here in Ithaca for many, many years. Just last year, we created our first mental health court. So an actual court completely built and designed for folks that are experiencing mental health problems, and that those mental health problems were the reason for their arrest. We are building a court where the sentences, instead of being punishments, are treatments surrounding their healthcare that can help them get better and improve. So that those three layers, from upstream, building a better economy that includes more people, to the point of intake, to what happens after, are all ways we're focusing here in Ithaca on improving our system.
It's interesting you raised that, because there are some who elevate the idea that our drug treatment courts, much maybe in the way of mental health courts, aren't as effective as they think they should be, right? That's what some purport. And how do you respond to that? Because this idea of sanctions being put in place, right, and graduated sanctions to hold people accountable to their adhering to their treatment engagement is almost akin to this punishment paradigm again, right? Mm-hmm. So how, and it's tricky, I understand. What are your thoughts on that, Mayor? Because that's an argument that people raise, right?
Yeah, no, and they're not wrong. I mean, it's better than nothing, but it's not the best we could do, if that makes sense. And that's not a great bumper sticker, right? If you're running for office, better than nothing, but not the best we could do. And I think those drug treatment courts are better than what we did before, which was just straight jail. Now it's we're going to help you get help, or we're going to send you to jail. I think what you find is that when people have access to help and they choose it of their own volition, they are more likely to be successful in their recovery and in their ongoing recovery. And that's what we need. That's the systems that we need to build in America. We can also go upstream from the drug treatment courts, because the treatment courts themselves are fine, but it takes a lot of time. The person still gets arrested. It goes on their record. They get their picture in the paper, their name printed in the paper, spend a couple nights in jail. Right. It can ruin you can cost you your job. It can cost you your relationship. It can break relations between family. All of the things I just said are things that make it less likely for a person to recover, not more. Right?
Absolutely.
If you lose your relationships and your job, especially if you're using hard drugs, it can push you deeper into your dependency. So moving even further upstream, what we're now doing in Ithaca is law enforcement assisted diversion, pioneered out in Seattle. Our LEAD program, the intention is right at the point of arrest, pre-booking and those couple nights in jail and the time before the judge, right at the point of arrest, you can the officers can divert folks into treatment or other options. And we think that's an improvement even on the drug treatment courts.
Sure, Mayor. And, when we think about the drug treatment courts, et cetera, one of the things that's been raised too by advocates is that, people have real traumatic experiences sometimes by going before a bunch of people sometime in a courtroom to talk about their addiction history, right? Or how they're doing in a drug treatment program, which obviously exposes people's privacy in a way that forces people to not even want to sometimes engage that, right? I come before a judge, I have a substance use issue, or I'm in a treatment program. There are people in the courtroom for other things, right? And yet they're talking about, so how are you doing with your heroin addiction while you're inside of the treatment? So that's something to consider and has been lifted up, Mayor. What are your brief thoughts on that? Because I'm going to transition to a really important thing that's happening in New York State and nationally, and the concern that advocates have about people that's incarcerated in police?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think it gets down to what is our philosophy of change? What is our theory of change? Why do people change their behavior? And do they change their behavior because of fear and fear of punishment?
And shame.
Is there a limit? Yeah, is there a limit to what that fear and what that punishment and what that shame can do? And I think there is a limit to what fear and punishment and shame can do before, when you're over pressing those levers. And there's no doubt. The fear of being called in the principal's office works for a lot of people. The fear of getting arrested works for a lot of people. Somebody's been arrested 12 times. If somebody's living on the street, they're using heroin. That fear and punishment, we are so far beyond that point of fear and punishment that it's ridiculous that we keep even attempting it, right? We have to attempt a different model with those folks. We have to try a more compassionate approach and to understand that there are real barriers. You mentioned genetics, it's physiological barriers to getting substance free, and that when combined with societal factors, continuing to shame people is not pulling them in closer, it's pushing them further away. And so we have to adopt a new philosophy on how we're going to help people with substance abuse. And we really do just have to be very honest with ourselves. There will always be, across societies and across time, people with drug-seeking behavior and with substance dependence. And we have to figure out for those people, what should life look like? What can life look like? Can they still lead healthy lives? Can we increase the chances that they decrease their drug use? Yes, but it will require a whole new form of thinking about drugs.
Absolutely. I'm made to think of Danielle Sarah's work. I don't know if you've heard of Danielle Sarah before. She's written a book called Until We Reckon, an author's analysis on the drivers of violence and different ways we can engage accountability instead of punishment. But her name is Danielle Sarah. She has a book out called Until We Reckon. So in our closing minutes, Mayor, and thank you for this conversation, one of the major pressing things that a lot of advocates in the criminal legal reform world are amplifying is this idea of people in prison while COVID-19 is occurring, right? Or current COVID-19 is in existence, and the releasing of people. And I'm sure this is happening nationally, right? What are people incarcerated? What are they doing with people incarcerated relative to addressing COVID-19 with proper PPEs, access to the vaccination beyond just the 65-year-old or vulnerable population? Talk a little bit about that in your closing remarks, please.
Sure. It's more revealing of the state of our prison system than it is anything else, that when a health crisis hits, the only sensible response is to release people from those prisons, right? If think about this, if somebody is in your custody, think about this as a person, as a family. If somebody is in your custody, they are your ward. You are to be taking care of them. You're supposed to feed them, you're supposed to house them, and you're supposed to rehabilitate them, right? Something's gone wrong and they need your help and support. And a crisis hits and you think and the only reasonable thing to do is to say, well, obviously in this crisis, this person cannot stay in your custody. You gotta ask yourself, why is that? Is it because in the first place, our prisons were never healthy places? Or is it because our prisoners are dehumanized, removed from their dignity, removed from their health and their safety? This should be a moment where obviously the people who are inside, because they're deprived of their freedom while they're being rehabilitated, they should also be kept safe from the pandemic by every means available. But this is a moment where we should rethink prisons in general, rethink the way they operate and the way they function. And I should also say, not to put all the weight just on the prison system alone, this revealed so many cracks in our government in general. The very fact that, a year ago this time, we were hand sewing masks and distributing them to neighbors. We were all guessing at the best health guidance. We're getting conflicting signals from our local officials versus our federal officials. The fact that Black people died at disproportionate rates from this pandemic. The fact that right now vaccine distribution is being done haltingly and is difficult for people to get hands. That's a result of the same failure of imagination, our failure to recognize that we are all in this together. That what happens to you matters to me. And that is not separate from our failures in the criminal justice system. That's all part and parcel. When we think of crime, we think that it's a bad person, they need to be separated from us, and it has nothing to do with us. Well, community successes are community successes. We built a system in which LeBron James could become a millionaire playing basketball. We built a system in which Bill Gates could become a billionaire through computers. We did that together. And that is a community success, and we should get to enjoy those computers, and we should get to enjoy that basketball watching. But when people fail, that's a community failure too. Absolutely. And we all need to look inward and see how we can build a better system.
Mayor Myrick of the city of Ithaca in New York, we thank you so much for joining us here at Both Sides of the Bars, and we certainly look forward to hearing from you again. How can people get in contact with you if you'd like for folk to contact you?
Sure, yeah. I'm at Svante Myrick, SVANTE MYRICK. Or you can just yell at me on the street. That's what most people do.
Okay. Mayor Myrick, again, thank you so much for joining Both Sides of the Bars, and we hope to hear from you soon.
Thanks, sir. Appreciate it.
And so you, the viewer, have been listening to Both Sides of the Bars and viewing this show with Mayor Myrick out of Ithaca. We thank you for joining today's episode of Both Sides of the Bars. And we ask you, the viewer, to continue to view Both Sides of the Bars and share it with others. You can also view this show on the website of the Fortune Society by Googling www.fortunesociety.org. And you can begin to view this segment as well as all of the other segments. We're also on YouTube and other places. So as always, thank you for joining Both Sides of the Bars, and we look forward to seeing you in our next episode.